Hi, welcome to another episode of Tea with Tara. Today I sit down with actor Stephen Atherholt, who portrays Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the new movie I Heard the Bells. Stephen has a BA in theater from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University. In 2001, he joined Sight and Sound Theaters for the production of Abraham and Sarah and has appeared in various roles for more than 10 years. He currently serves as the director of musical theater at Lancaster Bible College. And in just a few moments, Stephen will join me and I will ask him about what it was like to step into the shoes of one of America's most beloved poets, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Tea with Tara. I'm joined by Stephen Atherholt. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
So I want you to tell me a little about your career as an actor. How did that begin?
Even in high school, I loved doing theater, and I decided, the old adage, if you do what you love, you never work a day of your life. And so I decided to pursue theater, went for my undergraduate degree in theater with a focus in acting, and then, excuse me, and then went on to a Master's of Fine Arts degree with a focus in acting, knowing that at some point I was going to want to teach theater as well, because I just love the craft.
So you're also an acting coach as well?
Yes, I'm actually a professor at Lancaster Bible College. So I'm the director of musical theater.
And when did you begin your career with Sight and Sound?
Oh, back in 2001, I auditioned and started working on stage as a performer. I worked there for over 12 years on stage.
I had the pleasure of seeing the production of Jesus at Sight and Sound, and it was wonderful. Were you part of that?
I actually read for the character of Jesus on the initial scratch track, which is kind of the base with which they build all of the orchestration around it. So I was still there when they were preparing the show, and I had the opportunity to do the voice for Jesus on the initial recording, but I was not in the show. No, I was already working here at the university.
That theater is amazing. They put on some amazing productions.
Yeah.
Um, I want to delve into the movie a little bit. I Heard the Bells. And of course, it's based on the poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, were
Mhm.
you familiar with the poem prior to doing the movie?
I was, yeah, as a Christmas Carol and the poem itself, I was familiar with that and a few other of his works, but not a whole lot. It took quite a bit of research for me to really kind of get a good grasp as to who he was.
And I saw the movie when it first came out, and it was absolutely amazing. I love the writing, which I found so personal and poetic, and the acting, which I truly, my opinion, it's Oscar worthy. I mean, you guys deserve an Academy Award for the performances. And I know people who are really not into poetry, so they don't read Longfellow, but they saw the movie and they were absolutely captivated by the performances, by the story, by the writing. So I was wondering, how difficult was it for you to step into the shoes of such an iconic poet like Longfellow?
It was a lot. Initially, just reading biographies about him, finding out about his first wife, Mary, and how and what his experience was, and multiple times through Henry's life, he almost goes mad. He even says that in his writings. When he lost his first wife, when he lost Fanny, there's just the grief process for Henry was so intense because he's a poet. I really feel like he experiences highs very high and his lows very low. He takes life in all ways. He loves his family so incredibly much, but he lives in this emotional plane as a poet that when the grief strikes, it is so intense, he gets lost in his own life. So for me, to journey with him in a way where we can kind of cross over, because if you don't cross over with the character you're playing on a film in that particular medium, it won't read as honest, it won't read as true.
Right.
It's just too close. It's too intimate of a medium that you have to really find that character and drop into the character, or else people will know.
And what was the research process like for you?
There's a lot of reading. The Cross of Snow is a good biography about Henry. It includes a lot of his journal writings as well as his relationships with other with Hawthorne and with all these other writers. Kind of gives you an idea of what his life would have been like in the time period, the level of wealth, his education, working with Harvard and traveling overseas. Of course, writing Hyperion, in the way that he wooed his wife, Fanny, of the time over a period of 7 years, trying to get her to fall in love with him. All of that, just learning about him, helped to create the framework for who he was in my mind.
And how deep was Longfellow's faith before his wife passed away?
In the film, anyway, and it did seem that in his own life, it was fairly shallow prior to Fanny's death. And I think part of that is his level of comfort. Fanny, the Appleton family was very wealthy. Henry did well for himself. He was one of the highest paid poets of the time. So he was successful in his own right. He was a Cambridge professor, at Harvard. But then when he married into the Appleton family, his wealth was much greater. The level of comfort, the level of joy in his life was very high. It was said of them that, their happiness was so profound that any change would surely be for the worse. And so that was actually spoken by Sumner, Senator Sumner, not long before Fanny's death. So here's a man who has everything. He's got a beautiful wife, beautiful children, a beautiful home, plenty of money. He's really living very well. And I think the need for a spiritual grounding in his life was not extremely strong at that time. And Fanny, in the film anyway, we take the approach that when Fanny was alive, my faith was alive. And with Fanny gone, where's my faith? What is my faith? And that's part of the crisis of the film, of course.
So do you agree that their marriage was kind of a testament to a good Christian, strong marriage?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, from everything I could see, they loved each other dearly. He respected her very much in a time when, women were put in the background. Well, they still are, unfortunately, but especially in that time period. She was progressive. She was one of the first women to use ether in childbirth, which was, at the time a really big deal. And she really was his equal, and he knew that. And that was part of why he pursued her so heavily. And so because of that level of respect that he had for her, they were able to, I think, to have a marriage that was on the same plane, that was equal, respectful, loving, kind. He cherished her for sure.
Now, Longfellow, as we know, was dealt 2 blows in his life because he lost both of his wives, his first wife, Mary Potter. Tell me a little about Fanny's death and how he tries to save her.
Yeah, in history, he took a rug. He was in his study. She was in what would have been the library. And they're right down the hall. If you've never been up to their homestead, it's set up fairly similar to the way the movie was shot. The rooms, the layout, the doors, it's surprisingly similar. So when her dress caught fire because of the crinoline in the dress, the horsehair, which they used to firm the fabric, when it caught fire and she met him basically in the study, outside the study, or right in the study, he tried to put her out with a rug. And eventually he did get the flames down, called for help, and she was burned severely all over her body. Her face was not burned, which is why even in the film, when they're closing the casket, you can see her face. That's actually historically accurate. The burns were on her body where her dress was, because it was so tight, and the way the dress was made, it couldn't come off easily. There was just no way to get it off. And being a hoop skirt, being a hoop, it allowed for all that airflow underneath. So for Henry, he did burn his hands, his face, which is part of why he grew his beard, was the scarring on his face. At least that was what we came to understand. But laying in bed after, he just kept repeating over and over and over again, I couldn't save her. Why couldn't I save her? Why couldn't I save her? So he took it on himself that he should have been able to save Fanny in that moment, and he didn't. We probably know now that she dehydrated. That was probably part of why she died. Infection wouldn't have taken in that quickly, because it was that night. The next morning, she woke up, she wanted coffee, and then passed away that day.
Wow. So Longfellow, playing the part of Longfellow, I imagine it required so many emotions from you as an actor. And in the beginning of his life, he's obviously in a much happier state of mind, surrounded by his poetry, his family, his faith. Tell me a little, and you've already touched upon it, but can you tell me a little about how you as an actor felt stepping into that state of mind after the death of Fanny?
Well, as an actor in film, you don't have the privilege of shooting linearly like you do with a theater. With a theater, you start the show at the beginning and you end the show at the end. But with the film, my co-star was not able to shoot for the first 3/4 of the film. So we shot all of the loss scenes first. And so the process of getting into that, there's some association you can do as an actor to delve into a very deep, dark place personally. But if you start using your own life, you start using even pieces of truth surrounded by emotional, imaginary circumstances, it can pull you out of the reality of what the character is going through. So for me, I had to find this deep emotional connection to a portrait of Rachel Hughes, who's my co-star, photoshopped into a picture of Fanny Appleton Longfellow, and that portrait had to mean something to me. So we didn't get to shoot any of the earlier portion of the film where we were actually happy together until the end of the movie process. So putting all of that emotional depth and love into just a picture was a challenge. But if you're willing to buy in as an actor, vulnerability is just something that's required of you. And so opening yourself up in complete vulnerability to the circumstances of someone else's life, but buying in that I'm living that in this moment, and all of the stimulation and everything that's happening to me, or is happening to Henry, is happening to me in this moment, is how I was able to really kind of cross over with him in the reality of the moment and go into that emotionally. And then the end of the film was just a pleasure because we got to shoot all of the really fun, wonderful family scenes. And after having already experienced all of the loss, it just kind of made it really sweet.
And once you're immersed in the role of Henry, is it hard to break away from it at the end of the movie and go back to just being Stephen, or do you carry him with you still?
I still carry him with me, specifically right after shooting. That's true both in having a relationship with someone like Rachel on set. We knew each other. We had a relationship already. Thankfully, I know her husband. She knows my wife. We're all very good friends. And so that's an insulating factor to having a relationship with someone on stage. But there still is an extrication coming out of a relationship in a scene, as well as coming out of the deep trauma. So when you see actors get lost in themselves when they're in a character, that's a very real thing, because while your brain, you have, your conscious side of your brain, and you have your emotional subconscious part of your brain. And as you dive into the character, you will begin to think in a certain way, and neurons that fire together wire together. So all of this kind of goes into the character as you are portraying the character emotionally. Your brain, your creative side of your brain, really has no way to differentiate that these things are not happening to you.
Right.
And so after you come out of the character, experiencing all of this loss and this pain, you do need to decompress back out of that, because while consciously I understand that this didn't happen to me, I'm pretending, the unconscious part of my brain doesn't know that. And so I experienced some depression after performing as Henry. And I would wake up just really, really sad. And I'd even ask my wife, why do I feel so sad today? And then I'm like, oh, of course, I watched my wife burn to death yesterday. And while that didn't actually happen, my emotional side of my brain doesn't know that.
Right.
And so you have to decompress out of the character in order to get yourself back into a healthy place.
And the movie, of course, as we talked about, deals so much with faith and loss of faith and then regaining faith. What do you think audiences can learn about faith through Longfellow's eyes?
Well, I think that in America, we have so much comfort. We really are, we worship comfort. We want all of our comfort surrounding us all of the time. And I think that's a beautiful, wonderful thing that we have. It's a gift, but it's an insulating factor from our faith. It can be. Which is why a lot of my friends who are in missions and people I've worked with overseas, we always say, hey, we're praying for you because you have so little. And they're like, no, 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 we're praying for you because you have so much. And I think that's part of Henry's story was he just had everything. He didn't really need God. And when that is stripped away from him, when Fanny is stripped away from him, he almost loses Charlie. Uh, it's when his crisis happens when he really becomes grounded. And I think persecution and crisis are the two primary factors that often drive us to our knees. And I think what we hopefully can learn from this is don't let it come to that. Yes, we have comfort, but just remember what you're living for, who you're living for, because all of this is for naught. If we're living just to live a comfortable, nice, cushy lifestyle, what are we doing? That's not what we're here for.
And playing Longfellow, was there any particular scene? Because, of course, he was a complex human being, as we all are. And I know that you just talked about the death of Fanny and how difficult that was. Were there any other scenes that you found particularly difficult to play?
Well, the fun scenes, the real life interactions with Sumner at the banquet party, while those in some ways are just relaxed and nice scenes, like they're not requiring the same emotional depth, you still have to find the truth of it. It can be easily overplayed, I think, in a lot of ways. And so I think in general, performing in that form, with again such a close lens, taking everything in, the whole process was a challenge, to be honest, in it, especially with some more heightened moments, like the children's hour. I think is something that we in this time period don't really understand. If people watch it, they're like, oh, that could be seen as played over the top. When the reality is this is a family tradition. This is something that the Longfellow family would do in the Christmas season. Is these girls loved when Daddy wrote poetry about them. They loved it. And to hear Dad reciting the poem and the girls having the opportunity to live out the moments of the poem that he's written and reenact it together was a fun family event. So to be able to play that honestly was a challenge because it's not lines, it's not natural conversation happening. It's a reciting of poetry on film with kids jumping all over you, doing something that nowadays we're like, oh, we're just going to sit down and watch a movie. We don't really understand this interactive, poetry within a family. So yeah, it was challenging, and hopefully, I think for most people, I think it read honest. I think for some people, it may read a little over the top, and that's okay. That's part of what Josh Ank understood this film to be, is that there's a theatrical flair to it. We started Sight and Sound as a theater, and so in doing this, we want to do it honestly, but there's going to be a little bit of a flair that is a bit theatrical in it.
And one of the relationships that captivated me in the movie is Longfellow's relationship with his son Charles, who goes off to war and is wounded. Now, do you think Charles being wounded in the war played any part in Longfellow rediscovering his faith?
Well, yes, I do. I think, in our version of the film, Charlie is a big catalyst for calling him back to writing. I don't know that that's actually historically accurate anyway. That's our take on it. But I think anytime we are put into a crisis situation, we have a decision to make as to whether or not we're going to try to lean on our own strength or we're going to lean on the strength of a God who loves us. And so in that moment of hearing that Charlie has been shot and dealing with the fact that he may lose his son, especially after promising Fanny that he wouldn't allow that to happen, I'm sure was another just a crisis point. that helped him get to where he needed to be before he was ready to receive Christ.
Is there anything about Longfellow that you learned that perhaps you really didn't know prior to playing the part?
I learned a lot. I only had a very small amount of knowledge about Longfellow really before playing him. So I learned what an amazing human being he was. He was just a very kind man. He was always kind to people that would come to his door, even later on in life. He always kept a signed stack of autographs for people, even if they came asking for William Shakespeare, which people sometimes did. He'd be like, no, William Shakespeare does not live here. And then he would give them a signed copy, and they'd be like, oh, Longfellow. So just the quality of the human being that he was, the creative, the way that he saw the world. It was just yeah, it was a pleasure to be able to be a part of his journey for this film.
And of course, there are so many themes throughout the movie, but what do you consider to be the heart of I Heard the Bells?
Hmm. There is no trauma, crisis. There's nothing you can do in your own life that can take you away from the Lord, for one, but also there's no grief so great that there cannot be hope found on the other side. And I hope that in the midst of loss, especially those that have lost loved ones, and how hard this holiday season is for those people, I hope that they can see that they're not alone, and that loss is a part of our journey, because this is not our destination. You know, this is a journey. It was Longfellow's journey. He's already had his journey and he's done, and now it's our turn. And that the loved ones that we've lost in our time, they still speak. They're still there. You know, they're waiting for us in heaven. And so I just hope people walk through this encouraged by the end of the film in finding hope.
And people still respond to his poem, which I'm not sure how many people have actually read the poem or they're just familiar with the song, but it still speaks to people's hearts even to this day,
Yeah.
especially in the times that we're going through right now. And finally, what do you hope people would learn about Longfellow that they didn't know before, perhaps, or what do you want them to take away from the life of Longfellow?
Well, I hope they become interested in him and read more of his poetry. You know, we highlight a number of the different poems that he wrote in the film, and they're gorgeous. I mean, just beautiful poems, and a lot of them really just stand the test of time in that they're the heart of the human experience. That he was just very good at capturing human existence and putting it on paper. And I hope that people kind of fall in love with the Longfellow story, go visit his homestead, you know, up in Cambridge, uh, visit his grave, learn more about him, read poetry, kind of come to understand who he was as a person, the love that he shared with the world. Yeah, and be encouraged by the story.
Well, Stephen, I appreciate you being on. Thank you so much for being in this movie because if anybody has not seen this movie, they need to. It's beautiful, beautiful performances, one of the best movies of the year. I Heard the Bells. Stephen Atherholt, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.